At 22, she had already learned the final math of grief, the cruel subtraction that leaves you with less than you started with, less than zero. She had lost her father, the quiet man who smelled of sawdust and river damp. She had lost the house she grew up in, its every squeaking floorboard and dusty sunbeam sold off with a cool, transactional smile. She had lost, most profoundly, the belief that family was a fortress. It was, she now knew, just a word people used while they were taking things from you. All her stepmother, a woman of sharp angles and pale carpets, had left her was the old grist mill down on the creek, a sagging spine of timber and stone the county valued at $1 for tax purposes, a token sum for a token property. The lawyer, a man whose softness had been starched out of him by years of paperwork, had actually chuckled, a dry little rustle of a sound, when she'd signed the deed, taking the ruin instead of the paltry buyout her stepmother had offered. He, like everyone else, saw a girl clinging to a ghost, choosing a pile of rotting wood over a few $1,000s that might have given her a start somewhere new. They all laughed, not with malice, but with the easy pity of the practical for the sentimental. But what nobody knew, what the lawyer with his clean fingernails and the stepmother with her brittle grace could never comprehend, was that her father had measured his life in the turning of the seasons, not the turning of a prophet. He had built his meaning out of things that grow in the dark, and the true fortune of the mill was not in its stones, or its land, or the rushing water it straddled. It was buried, hidden deep beneath the worn floorboards where the dust of 100 years of grain had settled. That, though, comes later. First there was the funeral, a day of relentless, polite grayness. The sky was gray, the suits were gray, the words spoken over the polished coffin were gray and smooth and meant nothing at all. Her stepmother had stood beside her, a statue of tasteful sorrow, her hand resting on Ilara's arm, not for comfort, but for ballast, for show. Ilara had felt the chill of the woman's rings right through the fabric of her sleeve. Later, back at the house that was no longer hers, the air thick with the scent of lilies and baked ham, the lawyer had unclasped his briefcase with a sigh. The will was simple, he'd said, brutally so. The house, the savings, the stocks her father had inherited and never touched, it all went to his wife. It was, the lawyer explained, standard, expected. And then, the final clause, the one that felt like a joke or an insult. To my daughter, Ilara, I leave the old mill and the 2 acres it sits on, in the hope she might find some use for it. The stepmother had smiled then, a thin, tight stretching of her lips. Your father was so sentimental, she'd murmured, loud enough for the lawyer to hear. He could never let go of that old place. The buyout offer was made right there, over the lukewarm coffee and the picked-at platters of food. $5,000. For the land, her stepmother had clarified. The structure itself would have to be demolished, of course. An eyesore. A liability. Ilara had looked at the woman who had shared her father's bed for a decade, a woman who had never once set foot in the mill, who had wrinkled her nose at the flour dust on his clothes, and she had felt a silence grow inside her. It was a cold, hard silence, the kind that comes after everything has been said and everything has been taken. She said no. The lawyer had blinked. Her stepmother's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Don't be foolish, dear, she'd said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. It's a gift. Take the money. There's nothing for you there. But there was. There was the last piece of him they hadn't managed to polish away, to appraise and sell. There was the one thing he had held on to, stubbornly, uselessly, against all reason. She took the deed. She walked out of that house, leaving the scent of lilies and hypocrisy behind, and did not look back. The town watched her go. They saw a girl, orphaned and cheated, clinging to a wreck. They saw a fool. What they couldn't see was the quiet strength hardening in her spine, the inherited stubbornness that had kept a stone mill standing for a century and a half. She had nothing left to lose, and in that emptiness, she was finally free to find what was truly hers to claim. Her father had been a man of few words and many textures. The rasp of his calloused hands, the smooth, cool feel of a river stone he'd polished in his pocket, the fine, almost silky dust of milled flour that clung to his eyebrows and the creases around his eyes. He lived in a world of tactile truths. While her stepmother spoke of markets and investments, he spoke of the weather, the height of the creek, the particular heft of a sack of winter wheat. He was, to the modern world, an anachronism, a ghost haunting the machine of progress. Silas, who ran the old hardware store in the village, the kind of place that smelled of metal shavings and damp cardboard, was the one who kept the memory of the man, not the caricature. He'd leaned on a dusty counter, a pencil tucked behind his ear, and looked at Alara over the top of his spectacles. "Your father," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, "was the only man I ever knew who listened more than he talked. People thought he was simple. He wasn't simple. He was quiet. There's a difference." He told her how her father had bought the mill 30 years ago, when the last of the old millers had died off, and the building was already sinking into the riverbank. He'd paid next to nothing for it. Everyone said he was crazy. The world ran on electricity now, on giant corporate elevators and steel rollers. A water-powered grist mill was a museum piece, and a crumbling one at that. But he loved the sound of it, Silas had continued, staring out the window toward the creek. The groan of the timbers, the rumble of the stones, the rush of the water. He said it was the sound of something real, the sound of bread being born. For years, he'd milled for the few local farmers who still grew heirloom grains, taking a small portion as his fee, barely enough to keep the lights on in their small house. Her stepmother had hated it. She called it his hobby, her voice dripping with a condescension that curdled the air. She'd wanted him to sell the land to developers who were already sniffing around the valley, picturing waterfront condos and tidy marinas. He had always refused. "Some things," he used to say, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag, "don't have a price, they just have a worth." It was his favorite aphorism, a line that had infuriated his wife and grounded his daughter. After the funeral, the stepmother had wasted no time. She had called Alara, her voice crisp and businesslike, all pretense of grief stripped away. A developer was making a serious offer for a parcel of land that included the 2 acres the mill sat on. It was a generous offer, she'd explained, one that would secure her own future. All she needed was for Alara to sign a single paper, a quitclaim deed. She'd even increased the buyout to $7,000, a gesture of goodwill. "It's for the best, Alara," she'd said, the words smooth and practiced. "The building is a hazard. It's dragging down the property value for the whole area. We have to be practical." Alara had stayed silent on the other end of the line, twisting the phone cord in her fingers. She could picture her stepmother perfectly, sitting in the white living room, a folder of legal documents on the glass table beside her, her world reduced to a series of transactions. "He loved that place," Alara had finally said, her voice small but firm. There was a pause. A sigh of exasperation crackled through the receiver. "Your father loved a memory. He was clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore. It's a ruin, Alara. A pile of stones and rotten wood. Let it go. Be smart for once." The threat was there, wrapped in the silk of concern. The implication that Alara was not smart, that she was emotional and foolish, just like her father. The insinuation that standing in the way of this deal was an act of selfish sentimentality. "I'll think about it," Alara had said, just to end the call. But she had already made up her mind. She would not sell. She would not sign. She would not let the last true piece of her father be bulldozed and paved over for a view. She was done letting things be taken from her. She would go to the mill. She would see for herself what was there. She owed him that much. She owed herself that much. To stand on her own 2 acres of ground, however ruined, and claim it. The path to the mill was overgrown, a faint suggestion of a road surrendering to weeds and wild raspberry canes. The air grew cooler as she neared the creek, the sound of rushing water a constant, soothing hum beneath the buzz of insects. And then she saw it. It was worse than she remembered, and more beautiful. The stone walls, thick and mottled with a century of moss and lichen, seemed to grow right out of the riverbank. The great wooden water wheel, its paddles thick with green slime, was motionless, a frozen cog in a machine that time had forgotten. The roof sagged in the middle like an old man's back, and most of the windows were dark, vacant eyes. It smelled of damp earth, of wet stone, of the ghosts of grain and industry. It was a place of magnificent decay. She had a key, an old, heavy iron thing her father had kept on a hook by the back door, a key her stepmother had overlooked in her efficient purge of his belongings. It turned in the lock with a reluctant, grinding screech. The heavy door groaned open, and she stepped inside. The air was thick and still, shafts of dusty light cutting through the gloom from gaps in the roof. The vast, cavernous space was dominated by the silent machinery. The huge millstones, one nested atop the other, sat in their wooden housing like sleeping giants. Belts and pulleys snaked across the high, cobwebbed rafters. Everything was covered in a fine, pale dust, a mixture of flour and time. It was not a dead place, though. It was dormant, waiting. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the signs of her father. A workbench in the corner, tools laid out neatly, as if he had just stepped away. A pair of worn leather gloves resting on a sack of something that had long since hardened into a solid block. A thermos, old and dented, on a shelf. This was his sanctuary, the place he came to be himself, away from the sterile order of her stepmother's world. And then she saw him, not him, but his shadow, his echo. A great gray-muzzled dog, curled up on the floorboards in the center of the main room. Buster, her father's dog. He lifted his head, his tail giving a single, weary thump against the wood. He was old, arthritic, and had refused to stay in the pristine, fenced-in yard of the house her stepmother now occupied alone. He had, it seemed, come home. He whined softly, a low, mournful sound, and laid his head back on his paws, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't get up to greet her. He just watched, a silent, loyal sentinel. He was lying on a patch of floor that seemed odd. It was cleaner than the surrounding area, as if it had been swept. She took a step closer, and the old dog's tail thumped again, but he didn't move. He held his ground. A floorboard creaked behind her, and she spun around, her heart leaping. It was Silas, from the hardware store. He was holding a brown paper bag and a thermos. He gave her a small, sad smile. "Thought you might be here," he said, his voice soft in the echoing space. "Heard you told the witch no." He didn't need to clarify who he meant. "Brought you a sandwich. And coffee. A person can't think on an empty stomach." He set the offerings down on the workbench, his eyes scanning the vast room, a look of fond memory on his face. "Your father was a good man," he said again, as if the statement needed to be repeated, to be hammered into the very air of the place. Better than they knew. He saw things other people didn't. He looked over at the dog, who was still lying resolutely on the same spot. That old dog, too. He knows. He's been here ever since. Guarding the place. Guarding what? Elara wondered. A pile of rotting wood? A collection of obsolete machinery? She walked over to Buster and knelt down, stroking his coarse, gray fur. The dog leaned into her touch, letting out a long, contented sigh, but he did not get up. His body was a warm, heavy anchor on a specific set of planks. Beneath her knees, she could feel the solid, unyielding wood. She looked at the boards. They were old, scarred, worn smooth by a million footfalls and the rolling of a million sacks of grain. But something was not right. A detail so small she almost missed it. A single line, almost invisible in the dim light, that ran against the grain. The days that followed took on a rhythm. The rhythm of the creek, the rhythm of the rising and setting sun, the rhythm of a slow, unfolding mystery. Elara spent her hours at the mill, sweeping away the thickest layers of dust, cleaning the grimy windows to let in more light, breathing life back into the dormant space. Buster was her constant companion, a silent, watchful presence who rarely strayed from his chosen spot on the floor. He ate the food she brought him there, he slept there, he watched her from there. His vigil was unwavering. She brought coffee and books, but she found she couldn't focus on the words on the page. Her attention was constantly drawn back to the floorboards beneath the old dog. She would sit and stare at them, trying to decipher their secret. Silas would stop by in the late afternoons, bringing supplies or just conversation. He told her stories about her father, about the farmers who used to come, their trucks rattling over the old bridge. He talked about the different kinds of wheat, the way her father could tell them apart by the feel of the grain between his fingers. He never asked what she was looking for. He seemed to understand that she had to find it on her own. The anomaly was a quiet thing. It wasn't a map or a riddle, it was a disruption in a pattern. The nails in that section of the floor were different. Not old, square-headed wrought iron nails like the rest, but newer, round-headed wire nails. The wood itself, on closer inspection, was a slightly different species of oak, the grain tighter, the color a shade less gray. And there was that line, that seam, so perfectly cut it was almost invisible, a testament to a careful hand. She remembered her father at his workbench, the zen-like focus he had when he was measuring a piece of wood. "Measure twice, cut once," he would murmur, not to her, but to the wood, to the world. It was his mantra, the creed of a craftsman. He had not been a clumsy man. A hidden door in the floor would not be left with obvious signs. It would be made to fit, to blend in, to disappear. One afternoon, while Buster was outside drinking from the creek, she decided to act. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt like a trespasser, a grave robber, even though this place was now hers. She found a thin pry bar in her father's toolbox. Kneeling on the floor, she slid the flattened end into the almost invisible seam. She hesitated. What if there was nothing? What if this was just a patch, a simple repair, and her imagination, fueled by grief and hope, had spun it into something more? What if she was just as foolish and sentimental as her stepmother claimed? She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and damp stone. She pushed down on the bar. The wood resisted, then gave with a low, groaning complaint. The nails, newer and shallower than the rest, pulled free with a series of sharp squeaks. Slowly, carefully, she lifted a section of the floor, a perfectly cut trapdoor about 4 feet square. It was heavier than she expected. Beneath it was not dirt or stone foundation. There was darkness. A pocket of cool, still air rose up to meet her, carrying a scent she couldn't immediately place. It was clean, dry, and faintly aromatic. The smell of cedar. She peered into the opening. A set of steep, narrow wooden steps led down into a small, dark space. A hidden cellar. Her hands were shaking. Buster came back inside, his claws clicking on the floor. He walked to the edge of the opening, looked down, and then looked at her. He wagged his tail, a full, joyful swing this time, as if to say, "Finally, you found it." Using a flashlight from her car, she descended the steps. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, but it was a masterpiece of hidden construction. The walls were not the damp stone of the mill's foundation, but were lined, floor to ceiling, with smooth, fragrant cedar planks. The air was cool and dry, the humidity of the creekside world held perfectly at bay. And the room was full. Not with treasure chests or sacks of gold, but with shelves. And on the shelves, stacked with meticulous order, were hundreds of identical, handmade wooden boxes. Each one was about the size of a shoebox, crafted from the same pale, smooth wood, with tight-fitting lids and small, brass-plated latches. On the front of each box was a small, neatly hand-painted label. She ran her light over them. Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, Moon and Stars watermelon, Brandywine tomato, Turkey red wheat. On a small, built-in desk against the far wall sat a series of thick, leather-bound ledgers, just like the ones Silas used at the hardware store. She picked one up. It felt heavy, important. She opened it to the first page. In her father's familiar, careful script, a mix of block letters and cursive, was an entry. Item number 001. Radiator Charlie's Mortgage Lifter Tomato. Source: M.C. Biles, Logan, West Virginia. Story: developed in the 1930s by a mechanic with no formal plant breeding education to help people pay off their mortgages. Selected for size, flavor, and low acidity. Date acquired, May 1994. This was the fortune. Not gold, not money. It was something far stranger, far more valuable. It was a library of life, a secret ark built of cedar and stone, filled with the stories and the sustenance of a whole region, saved from a flood of forgetting. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the moment when a legacy, hidden in darkness, is brought into the light. It is the part where a daughter begins to understand the true measure of her father, a measure that had nothing to do with the size of his bank account and everything to do with the quiet, stubborn, and deeply hopeful work of his hands. What Alara found in that cellar was not an inheritance that could be spent, but one that had to be tended. It was a responsibility, a burden, and a gift, all at once. She spent the next several days down in the cool, cedar-scented air, pulling box after box from the shelves, opening the ledgers, and piecing together the secret life of the man she thought she knew. He had been a collector, a curator, a librarian of seeds. The boxes were filled with small, carefully labeled packets containing the seeds of thousands of varieties of vegetables, grains, and flowers. Many were heirlooms, passed down through generations of farming families. Others were from plants that were now considered endangered, crowded out by the handful of hybrid varieties that dominated modern agriculture. Each entry in the ledgers was a small, perfect story. He had recorded not just the name and species, but the history of the seed. He wrote down the names of the people who gave them to him: old farmers, backyard gardeners, people he'd met at granges and county fairs. He recorded the stories they told, the memories attached to a particular type of bean or a uniquely colored ear of corn. One entry told of a squash seed carried by a family on the Oregon Trail. Another described a drought-resistant wheat that had saved a small town during the Dust Bowl. It was a tapestry of survival, a history of a people written not in ink, but in genetic code. He had built this place with the same care he used to balance a millstone. The cedar lining was a natural insect repellent. The underground location kept the temperature stable. He had installed a clever ventilation system using small, hidden pipes that ensured a constant, slow exchange of fresh, dry air. It was a vault, designed and built by a single, determined man to protect a treasure the world had forgotten was valuable. As she read, the image of her father, the quiet, flour-dusted man tinkering with his obsolete machinery, transformed. He had not been clinging to the past, he had been fighting for the future. The mill wasn't a nostalgic hobby, it was the perfect cover. No one would ever suspect that a place of grinding and breaking was, in fact, a place of preservation and rebirth. The constant rumble of the stones, the ever-present dust, the reputation of the place as a relic, it was all a brilliant, humble camouflage. Her stepmother's scorn, the town's pity, the lawyer's chuckle, they had all been unwitting guardians of his secret. Their dismissal had been his shield. A deep aching love washed over Alara, so powerful it brought her to her knees on the cold cellar floor. It was a love mixed with the profound grief of not having known, not having understood. She had seen his dusty clothes and his greasy hands and his quiet stubbornness, but she had never seen the sheer scale of his purpose. She ran her fingers over a small wooden box labeled Grandma's Red Okra. She could almost feel the warmth of his hands, the steady, patient energy he had poured into this place, into this work, year after year, in secret. He hadn't left her a ruin. He had left her the heart of his life. He had left her a mission a purpose, a reason to fight. She now knew what she was guarding, and it wasn't a pile of stones. It was a promise. A promise made by generations of people who had saved and planted and harvested. A promise her father had taken upon himself to keep. And now it was hers. The weight of it was terrifying. The beauty of it was breathtaking. She closed the ledger, the scent of old paper and cedar filling her senses. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the mill's dusty windows. The world was going on, unaware of the vast, living library beneath the floorboards. But Alara knew, and that changed everything. The letter was waiting for her in the last box on the highest shelf, tucked in the very back corner of the cellar. The box was different from the others. It wasn't labeled with the name of a plant, but with a single word written in her father's neat block letters. Ilara. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of raw cotton, was not a packet of seeds, but a sealed envelope and a small, carved wooden bird, a wren, so detailed she could see the tiny feathers etched into the wood. She recognized it instantly. It was the first thing he had ever taught her to carve, sitting on the mill steps when she was just a little girl. She picked up the envelope. Her name was on the front. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was dated 6 months before he died. "My dearest Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. It also means you found this place, and I knew you would. You have my eyes. You see the things other people miss. You always did. I imagine your stepmother has made things difficult. I am sorry for that. Some people can only measure the world in dollars, and I was never very good at that kind of math. I hope you will forgive me for leaving you with this burden, this mess. People will tell you this old mill is worthless. They will tell you to sell it, to tear it down, to move on. Maybe they are right. Maybe this is all the foolish dream of an old man. But I don't think so. For 30 years, I have been collecting these seeds. I started when I realized the kinds of corn and beans I grew up with were disappearing. The world is getting faster, and it is getting louder, and it is forgetting the quiet, slow things that sustain us. Each seed in this room has a story. It has a history. It is a tiny, living piece of our past. But more than that, it is a promise for our future. A promise that we can feed ourselves, that we can be resilient, that we do not have to depend on a handful of giant companies for our daily bread. This is the real inheritance, Alara. Not the house, not the money. This. It is a library of hope. I don't know what you should do with it. You could sell the collection to a university or a corporation. It would probably fetch a handsome price. There is no shame in that. You deserve a comfortable life. Or you could continue the work. You could keep the library safe. You could share these seeds with people who want to grow them, to keep their stories alive. The mill isn't for grinding grain into flour anymore. The stones are just stones. The real work of this place is to grind hardship into hope, to turn forgotten things into new life. The choice is yours. Whatever you do, know that I am proud of you. You were the best thing I ever made. Measure twice, cut once. Love, Dad. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the page, smudging the ink. She clutched the letter to her chest, the little wooden wren digging into her palm. He had known. He had trusted her. He had seen her, even when she felt invisible. He had not abandoned her to a ruin. He had entrusted her with a kingdom. For hours, she sat on the cellar floor, the letter in one hand, the wren in the other, feeling the profound, anchoring weight of his love and his faith in her. The fear and uncertainty that had dogged her for weeks began to recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stay. She would continue the work. This was her place now. This was her purpose. She finally understood what he meant. You don't measure a life by what you accumulate. You measure it by what you pass on. He hadn't passed on money. He had passed on a reason. He had given her roots, not in a plot of land, but in a sacred, vital mission that was bigger than both of them. He had given her a fortune meant to be planted. The first official notice came on a Tuesday, tacked to the heavy oak door of the mill. It was a bright orange sheet of paper, stark and alien against the weathered wood. In bold, black letters, it declared the structure unsafe and scheduled for demolition in 30 days. It was signed by the County Planning Commission. Ilara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her stepmother was not giving up. She was using the power of bureaucracy, the impersonal force of rules and regulations, to get what she wanted. The $7,000 offer was no longer a gesture of goodwill. It was the price of a threat. That evening, her phone rang. It was her stepmother. Her voice was smooth, with a new, hard edge of triumph beneath the surface. "I saw the notice," she said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "It's a shame, but it's for the best. The offer still stands, Ilara. In fact, I've spoken with the developer. Given the circumstances, he's willing to be generous. 10,000. It will cover the demolition costs and leave you with something to start over. It's the smart play." The words hung in the air. The smart play. The final dismissal of her father's life, of Ilara's choice, of everything the mill represented. It was all just a game of numbers, and her stepmother was certain she held the winning hand. "It's not for sale," Ilara said, her voice low and steady. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Don't be a fool. In 30 days it won't be your choice. The county will condemn it, and the land will be seized for public auction. You'll be left with nothing. Absolutely nothing. Is that what you want? To end up with nothing, just like he did?" The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. Ilara felt the sting of them, but she also felt the fire they ignited in her chest. "He didn't end up with nothing," she said quietly, and hung up the phone. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were a date on a calendar, a ticking clock. She had 30 days to save not just a building, but a legacy. She knew she couldn't do it alone. The next morning, she went to see the town lawyer, the one who had chuckled at her. She walked into his tidy, beige office, holding one of her father's ledgers. She placed it on his polished desk. He looked at it, then at her, his expression a mixture of pity and impatience. "Miss, if this is about the mill, my hands are tied. The county's decision is final." "This isn't about the mill," she said. "It's about what's inside it." She opened the ledger to a random page. "This is an entry for Henderson's pink ponderosa bean. My father got the seeds from old Mr. Henderson just before he passed away. His family had been growing them in this valley since the 1880s. Your family, I believe." The lawyer stared at the page. He read his own grandfather's name, written in her father's hand. His composure flickered. She turned the page. "And this one, Mrs. Gable's Silver Queen corn. Your wife's grandmother. The story says she used to win the blue ribbon at the county fair with it every single year." She could see a struggle in his eyes. The starched collar of his shirt suddenly seemed too tight. He was a man caught between the sterile logic of the law and the messy, undeniable truth of his own history. He had been complicit, whether through weakness or willful ignorance, in the plan to erase this place. He had helped her stepmother, had treated Ilara with dismissive condescension. Now the very history he had helped discard was sitting on his desk, calling his own family by name. "My father saved them," Ilara said, her voice soft but unwavering. "He saved all of them. Hundreds of them. The history of this whole valley is sitting under the floor of that mill. And your client wants to bulldoze it for condominiums." The lawyer closed his eyes for a moment. He ran a hand over his face. When he opened them again, the pity was gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. "What did she do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ilara told him about the developer, about the pressure, about the offer that was made even before her father's funeral. The lawyer listened, his face growing paler with every word. He had been a pawn, and he knew it. He had allowed himself to be used, to dismiss the old miller as a sentimental fool, while his sharp, modern wife was planning to sell off his legacy. The shame in his eyes began to harden into something else. A quiet anger, a need for atonement. He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder. "Your stepmother," he said, his voice flat, "has been in negotiations with this developer for over a year. Your father knew nothing about it." He slid a document across the desk. It was a preliminary sales agreement, contingent on acquiring the full parcel of land. It was dated 8 months ago. The lie was right there, in black and white. "There's a town meeting next week," he said, his voice regaining some of its professional steel, but with a new purpose behind it. "About the development proposal. You should be there." The town meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stale popcorn. The entire community seemed to be there, drawn by the promise of progress, of new money, of change. The developer, a man with a suntan and teeth too white for this part of the country, stood at a podium next to a glossy artist's rendering of the Mill Creek Estates. It showed a series of identical beige buildings, manicured lawns, and a pristine, sterile-looking creek front. Her stepmother sat in the front row, looking elegant and composed, the very picture of a grieving widow making sensible decisions for the future. Ilara slipped into a seat in the back, a single wooden seed box held tightly in her lap. The developer spoke of tax revenues, property values, and job creation. He used words like revitalization and opportunity. He referred to the old mill as a derelict structure and an unfortunate eyesore that was holding the community back. The crowd murmured in agreement. They were tired of seeing their town shrink, of watching their children leave for jobs elsewhere. The promise of something new was intoxicating. Her stepmother then spoke, her voice filled with a carefully modulated sadness. She spoke of her late husband's love for the old mill, but framed it as a gentle eccentricity, a refusal to let go of the past. "He would have wanted what's best for the town," she said, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "He would have wanted us to look forward, not back." It was a masterful performance. Ilara felt a surge of nausea. When the floor was opened for public comment, a tense silence fell over the gym. Ilara stood up. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. She looked small and out of place, a young woman in a faded work shirt clutching a wooden box. "My name is Ilara," she began, her voice shaking slightly but carrying in the quiet room. "The mill was my father's." She walked to the front, placing the box on the podium next to the developer's shiny brochures. She didn't look at her stepmother. She looked at the faces in the crowd. "I hear people talking about property values and tax revenues. My father measured value differently. He measured it in stories." She opened the box and took out one of the small, hand-labeled packets. "Amish paste tomato," she read. "The seeds came from the Miller family after they lost their farm. My father saved them." She looked over at an elderly couple in the third row. Mrs. Miller's hand went to her mouth. Ilara took out another packet. "Jimmy Nardello's sweet Italian pepper. From Sofia Rossi's grandfather. He brought them over from Italy in 1912. A murmur went through the crowd. Old man Rossi, sitting near the back, nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. One by one, she took out the packets. She read the names of the seeds and the names of the families they belonged to. Henderson, Gable, Peterson, Cho. Families whose roots in the valley went back generations. Families sitting right there in the metal folding chairs. She wasn't just reading a list. She was reciting the town's own biography. She was reminding them of a wealth they had forgotten they possessed. "This developer wants to build condos," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer. "My father built an ark. He spent 30 years saving our history, our food, our legacy. It's all there, in the mill. Hundreds and hundreds of stories waiting to be planted again. You can't put a price on that. It's a fortune we already own." A new sound filled the gymnasium, not the murmur of agreement for the developer, but a low, rising hum of recognition, of memory, of pride. The glossy rendering of the condos suddenly looked cheap and soulless. The real value, they were beginning to remember, was in the soil, in the seasons, in the things their own grandparents had held in their hands. The developer looked flustered. Her stepmother's face was a mask of cold fury. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was unraveling before her eyes. The moment hung in the air, thick and charged. The community was silent, caught between the glossy promise of the future and the rediscovered weight of their past. Then, a chair scraped against the polished floor. The town lawyer stood up. All eyes turned to him. He walked to the podium, his face pale but resolute. He did not look at Alara's stepmother. He looked at the townspeople, his neighbors, the people whose families were named in the ledger he had seen. "I have something to say," he began, his voice tight. "As a legal representative, I am bound by confidentiality. But as a member of this community, I am bound by my conscience. And my conscience will not let me stay silent." He took a deep breath. The plan to sell this land to this developer is not a recent one. It did not come about after a period of mourning or as a practical necessity. He held up a file folder. "I have here a preliminary agreement, drafted over a year ago, between the developer and—" He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, the late miller's wife. The sale was contingent on her acquiring the full property. The man whose memory has been invoked tonight in support of this project was, in fact, the only thing standing in its way. He refused to sell. He was never told about these negotiations. A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to be a practical widow. It was another to be a conspirator. Alara's stepmother shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "This is an outrageous lie, an ethical violation." The lawyer met her gaze, his own eyes cold. "Is it? Would you like me to submit this document, with your signature on it, into the town record?" Her mouth opened, then closed. The color drained from her face. She had been exposed, her polished facade shattered by a simple, undeniable fact on a piece of paper. She had underestimated everyone: the quiet daughter, the shamed lawyer, and most of all, the stubborn, sentimental man who had built his fortress of memories right under her nose. Defeated, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the gymnasium, the double doors swinging shut behind her, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The developer, seeing his local support evaporate, began to pack his glossy boards away with a grim expression. His project was dead. Silas was the first to speak. He stood up, his old frame straight and proud. "That mill is not a ruin," he boomed, his voice filling the cavernous space. "It's a landmark, and that girl's father was not a fool. He was a caretaker. He was taking care of all of us." Then old Mrs. Miller stood up. "My grandmother gave him those tomato seeds," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought they were gone forever." One by one, others began to stand. They told their own stories, of seeds given, of advice shared, of small kindnesses from the quiet man at the mill. The town meeting had transformed from a development hearing into a wake, a celebration, a collective remembering. The community chorus had found its voice. After the meeting, people didn't just leave. They came up to Alara, surrounding her not with pity, but with respect, with awe. They touched the wooden box as if it were a holy relic. They asked questions. They offered help. "I've got some old oak planks in my barn," one farmer said. "Good and seasoned. You could use them to fix that floor right." "I can have a look at that roof for you," a contractor offered. "My boy and I can patch it up on Saturday." The lawyer approached her, his face etched with remorse. "I'll file for a historical designation for the mill first thing in the morning," he said. "Pro bono, of course. It's the least I can do. I'll also handle any further legal issues with your stepmother. You won't have to speak to her again." Alara looked at the faces around her, at the hands reaching out to her, at the shared history that had been resurrected in this noisy, echoing gym. She had come to the mill feeling utterly alone, an orphan fighting a losing battle. Now, she was surrounded. She had found her family. Not a family of blood or name, but the kind that matters more. The family that shows up. The days that followed were a blur of activity. a symphony of communal restoration. The town, awakened to the treasure in its midst, descended on the old mill, not with demolition equipment, but with toolboxes and lunch pails. The farmer with the oak planks arrived in his truck, the wood smelling of sunshine and time. The contractor and his son scrambled over the roof, their hammers echoing a cheerful, rhythmic beat as they replaced the rotten shingles. The women of the town's historical society came with buckets and rags, gently cleaning a century of grime from the intricate machinery, revealing the beautiful grain of the wood and the cast iron maker's marks. Silas became the unofficial foreman, directing traffic, dispensing advice, and keeping everyone supplied with coffee and hardware. Buster, the old gray dog, presided over it all from the porch, accepting pats and bacon bits with the quiet dignity of a king. Ilara moved through the controlled chaos in a state of grateful wonder. She was no longer just the caretaker. She was the curator, the keeper of the stories. People brought her things, old photographs of the mill in its heyday, their own family seeds, carefully saved in jars and envelopes, asking if they could be added to her father's collection. The hidden cellar became a revered space, a quiet sanctuary in the heart of the bustling work. She led small, reverent tours, showing people the neat rows of boxes, reading the stories from her father's ledgers. The shame the town had felt for overlooking the quiet miller had transformed into a fierce, protective pride. This was theirs. This was who they were. A large agricultural corporation got wind of the story and sent a representative, a man in a crisp suit who looked as out of place as the developer had. He offered Ilara a staggering sum for the entire collection. He spoke of gene patents, of research and development, of preserving the material in their state-of-the-art facilities. He saw a resource to be owned, a commodity to be exploited. Ilara listened politely, then showed him the door. "This collection isn't for sale," she told him, echoing the words she had said to her stepmother. "It's for planting." The lawyer was true to his word. The mill was granted historical protection, shielding it from any future development. He also handled the final, bitter severing from her stepmother, a clean legal cut that left Ilara with the mill, free and clear, and her stepmother with a house full of pale carpets and a reputation she would never live down. The redeemable antagonist, having confessed and made amends through his work, became a quiet ally, his shame replaced by a humble sense of purpose. He had helped save the very thing he had once been complicit in destroying. As autumn cooled the air and the leaves on the sycamores by the creek turned to gold, the work on the mill slowed. The roof was sound, the windows were glazed, the great water wheel had been freed from the rust and sludge that had held it captive. It wasn't a pristine restoration. The mill still wore its age with grace. The stones were still mossy, the timber still dark with time. It hadn't been turned into a museum, it had been brought back to life. Ilara, with the help of a retired engineer who remembered working on the mill as a boy, even got the great stones turning again, slowly, majestically, powered by the eternal push of the creek. She didn't grind flour, not yet. For now, the sound was enough. The sound of something real. The sound of a heart beating again in the center of the valley. She spent her days in the cellar, cataloging the new seeds, cross-referencing her father's notes, learning the slow, patient language of her inheritance. She wasn't just guarding a collection, she was becoming a part of its story. She was the next link in a chain that stretched back through generations. She had found her work. She had found her home. She had found her fortune, the kind that grew in the dark and was meant for the light. 1 year later, the mill stood as a testament to what a community could save when it remembered what was worth saving. The water wheel turned in a slow, steady rhythm, its movement a quiet pulse in the valley. The path to the mill was no longer overgrown, but was a well-trodden lane. People came and went, some to help, some to learn, some just to sit by the creek and listen to the sound of the water and the turning of the stones. Ilara had established a seed exchange. Local farmers and gardeners could come and get a starter packet of any of the heirloom varieties for free, with the simple promise that they would grow them, love them, and save some of the seeds from their harvest to bring back, ensuring the collection was not a static archive, but a living, evolving library. The fortune was not being hoarded. It was being shared, planted, and returned, growing richer with every cycle. Late one afternoon in the fall, as the sun slanted low and golden through the trees, a car she didn't recognize sputtered to a stop on the road near the bridge. A young couple and their small child got out, looking worriedly at the steam rising from their engine. They were new to the area, they explained, their faces smudged with anxiety. They were on their way to a new job, a new life, with everything they owned packed in their small car. Now they were stranded. Ilara, her hands covered in the rich, dark soil of the small garden she'd planted beside the mill, walked over to them. She offered them a drink of cold water from the well and the use of her phone. While the young man called for a tow truck, the young woman looked around at the mill, at the turning wheel, at the neat rows of late-season kale and squash in the garden. "This place is beautiful," she said, her voice soft with a kind of weary awe. "It feels peaceful. My father built it," Ilara said simply. "Well, he brought it back to life." They talked for a while, as the afternoon faded toward evening. Ilara learned their story, a familiar tale of searching for a place to put down roots, a place that felt real. Before they left, after the tow truck had come and gone, Ilara went inside the mill. She came back with a small, hand-stamped cloth pouch. She pressed it into the young woman's hand. "What is it?" the woman asked. "It's a start," Ilara replied. "Some seeds. An old tomato variety that grows really well in the soil here. They're called mortgage lifters. The story is, they helped a family pay off their farm once." The young woman looked down at the small, humble pouch, then back up at Ilara, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't have to say anything. The connection was made. A gift was given, no strings attached, an act of quiet generosity, just as her father must have done 100 times before. As she watched the family walk down the road toward the village, Ilara felt a profound sense of rightness, of a circle being completed. Buster, older and grayer still, came and leaned his heavy head against her leg. She rested her hand on his back, the familiar, comforting weight of him an anchor. She looked at her mill, her home. She looked at the creek, flowing on as it always had. She thought of her father, of his quiet hands and his secret, hopeful work. He was gone, but he was everywhere. His legacy was not in the stones or the machinery. It was in the soil, in the stories, and in the small, hopeful act of passing a handful of seeds to a stranger. Some fortunes aren't meant to be spent. They're meant to be planted.